I heard the hiss of the air conditioner fighting the relentless Houston heat, but the sound that truly froze me was my wife, Eleanor, laughing. "The old man is so predictable," she whispered into the phone. That was the moment. Not a gunshot, not a scream, but a casual, careless dismissal of the 4 decades I had spent building everything they currently stood upon. I didn't confront her. I never scream. Shouting is for men who have lost control, and control, for me, is everything. Instead, I stood in the doorway of my study, the shadow of the man who had built Atlas Logistics from a single rented truck to a fleet spanning 3 states. My hair had turned white, waiting for her to understand the value of sacrifice. But standing there, hearing her voice drip with disdain, I realized she wasn't waiting for me to teach her. She was waiting for me to die. I built this empire in the dust and sweat of the early 80s. I missed Christmases, watched my first marriage dissolve because I chose the road over the house, and drank coffee that tasted like burnt engine oil just to make the next delivery on time. Eleanor, 20 years my junior, was supposed to be the reward, the calm port after the storm. I gave her the penthouse in Miami, the credit cards, and the respect she craved. She gave me a beautiful, empty life and a son, David, who was raised on platinum spoons and entitlement. For the last 3 years, I had handed the reins of operations to David, hoping he would internalize the discipline required to run Atlas. I watched the quarterly reports slide, dismissing the data at first, blaming market fluctuations. But the market wasn't fluctuating. The culture was rotting from the inside. David was buying luxury cars and flying private, while driver retention plummeted and fuel costs mysteriously spiked. He treated my legacy like a personal ATM, an endless resource that replenished itself through magic. I needed proof, hard, undeniable proof that the rot went deeper than mere incompetence. I needed to see his true nature when the title of patriarch was stripped away, when he wasn't looking at the benevolent father but at an inconvenience. So I called my head of HR, a trusted man who had been with me since 1995, and explained the plan. He thought I was insane, but he knew better than to question a decision I had already made. Within 48 hours, a simple, blue jumpsuit was delivered to my house, along with a pair of cheap steel-toed boots and a new temporary ID badge. I introduced myself on Monday morning as Walter, the new maintenance hire, covering the night shift and reporting directly to David's operations manager. I grew a beard stubble, wore an old baseball cap low over my eyes, and perfected the walk of a man defeated by 4 decades of scrubbing floors. Slow, deliberate, invisible. My first week as Walter was horrifying. I watched David stroll into the office at 11 a.m., leave at 3 p.m., and spend the intervening hours scrolling through stock tickers on his phone while his team scrambled to cover his errors. He never learned the names of the loading dock staff, he never spoke to the drivers, and he treated Walter like a pest. I spent my nights documenting everything. I found invoices for consulting fees that traced directly back to Eleanor's sister's shell company. I discovered David was using Atlas Logistics credit accounts to furnish his new condo. Every piece of filth I cleaned from the marble floors was less repulsive than the calculated theft I uncovered in the ledger books. The ultimate test came in my 2nd week. I was scrubbing a stubborn stain near the entrance to David's private office. I had deliberately chosen that spot, knowing he would have to step over me. "Hey, Walter, right?" David's voice was sharp, impatient, the tone he used when addressing a malfunctioning vending machine. I straightened slowly, keeping my eyes downcast. "Yes, sir. You need to be faster. I just got a call from operations. The floor buffer broke down in loading bay B. Get down there and fix it now. We don't pay you to stand around." "I am sorry, Mr. Atlas," I replied, using the name I had carried with pride for half a lifetime. "I finished the hallway. I can go check the buffer, but that requires a different skill set." "I was hired for basic cleanup." David laughed, a short, unpleasant bark. "Oh, a janitor with boundaries, that's precious. Look, Walter, Atlas doesn't employ people who cause problems. We employ people who solve them. If you can't handle a simple repair, then I don't need you here." He stepped over my cleaning supplies, his Italian leather shoe narrowly missing my hand. I watched him walk away, arrogant and oblivious. That night, I finalized the paperwork. The test was over. David had failed, not just as an executive, but as a man. He had seen a tired older worker asking for minimal respect and crushed him without a second thought. The official execution was swift and merciless. I called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning, citing unforeseen operational instability. David walked in late, sipping a gourmet coffee, looking bored. Eleanor was there too, dressed in a new designer suit, ready to talk about the latest charity gala. I was sitting at the head of the table, not as Walter, the invisible janitor, but as the owner, the founder, the man who held every single deciding share. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even look angry. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady. "I have just completed a full internal audit of operations and finance. The results are unacceptable." David scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Father, we've had a difficult quarter, but the fundamentals are solid. The market will correct itself." "The market is fine, David," I countered, sliding 3 folders across the mahogany table. "Your performance is not." The first folder detailed David's unauthorized expenditures and the fabricated consulting invoices. The second contained the notarized termination letter for gross corporate misconduct. The third was the most important. It was the amended living will, dated 2 days prior. Eleanor opened it first. Her hand started shaking immediately. I had removed David from the will entirely, citing gross incompetence and moral failure, effective immediately. But I hadn't stopped there. Every asset jointly held with Eleanor, except for the bare minimum required by state law, was immediately transferred into an irrevocable corporate trust, securing Atlas's future and ensuring she could never touch it. Her Miami penthouse, paid for with company money, was already being listed. She stared at me, the color draining from her face, suddenly seeing not the predictable old man she mocked, but the lethal force of a lifetime of controlled fury. "You can't do this," she finally shrieked, her voice echoing in the silent boardroom. "I'm your wife. We're your family." I looked directly at David, whose face was now a mask of bewildered terror. "The man I hired as a janitor last week had more integrity than you do, son. You fired him because he asked for respect. That was the final insult to everything I built." I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "You have 60 minutes to clear your office, David. Security will escort you out." I didn't watch them leave. I had spent 4 decades looking after their comfort. Now I was focused on the clean slate. I called my trusted HR man and told him to hire Walter back permanently as head of internal security. I knew that job would require a quiet, intelligent presence, someone who understood the true value of loyalty. I walked back into my study that afternoon. The air conditioning was still fighting the heat, but the silence was different now. It was not the cold, dismissive silence of betrayal, but the deep, satisfying peace of absolute freedom. The empire was mine again, and this time the rot had been surgically removed. I was alone, but finally I was home. The quiet that settled over the study was deceptive. It was the stillness before a massive geological shift, the kind of silence only a man who knows the exact moment of explosion can appreciate. They mistook my composure for resignation. They saw the tired, aging businessman running on fumes, and they treated me like a poorly maintained heirloom, something valuable enough to keep in the vault until it could be liquidated. Eleanor and Derek were operating with the arrogant impunity of heirs who believe the signature on the death certificate is all that remains between them and unlimited wealth. They hadn't slowed down their machinations. They had accelerated them. I watched remotely as Derek, my own blood, the boy I taught to tie his first knot on the sailboat 25 years ago, met with his shadow CFO in a private room at the Dallas Country Club. They were discussing the restructuring phase, their coded language for the rapid dissolution of the non-core assets I had spent the last decade diversifying into. He wanted to sell the Seattle tech division for a fast cash injection, a move that would dilute our long-term value, but give him millions to burn immediately. The footage, crisp and clear, sat in an encrypted folder labeled Legacy, a file Eleanor and Derek were certain didn't exist. They weren't just stealing the money, they were desecrating the temple. I had installed Arthur as head of internal security for a reason. He was a ghost, a man who moved through corporate structures leaving no footprints, while Eleanor focused her energy on planning a lavish benefit gala, a perfect display of her anticipated status as the soon-to-be sole mistress of the empire. Arthur was quietly mapping every single digital thread connecting Derek's shell corporations back to our main accounts. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore, sir," Arthur had reported to me last Tuesday, his voice low and devoid of judgment over the secure line. Mrs. Vance used company funds to purchase the fractional ownership of the Cayman Islands condo. She signed the wire transfer herself, tagging it as miscellaneous corporate development. A sharp pain, cold and familiar, twisted in my chest. It wasn't the theft of the money. I could rebuild 10 times over. It was the profound, casual contempt for the decades I had sweated to build something honorable. I remembered the summer of 1985, sleeping on a cot in the warehouse office in Akron just to make sure the inventory count was accurate for the bank loan. Eleanor was there, briefly back then. She saw the grind. Now she saw only an ATM with a pulse. "Document the intent, Arthur," I instructed. "Show reckless disregard for fiduciary duty. I don't need infidelity, I need malfeasance. If she had simply taken the money and spent it on jewelry, that's divorce court. If she misrepresented it as corporate development, that's fraud. The distinction is everything." The investigation was a masterpiece of controlled paranoia. The security system in our sprawling Boston home was now reporting directly to Arthur's secured server. The smoke detectors in the main hallway were equipped with wide-angle optics. I knew when Eleanor left, whom she spoke to, and, most importantly, what she signed. She kept calling me darling, asking if I needed my medication adjusted, a subtle inquiry designed to confirm my mental decline, while simultaneously ensuring I stayed docile. My legal team, led by the granite-faced Ms. Harding from New York, was working on 3 parallel tracks. Track 1, the definitive revision of my last will and testament, structured as an irrevocable trust designed to protect the company from any challenge for 2 generations. Track 2, the complete isolation of Eleanor's assets, based on the ironclad prenuptial agreement she had signed 22 years ago, which stipulated that any property acquired through corporate fraud or proven malfeasance would be automatically forfeit. Track 3, the meticulous preparation of the evidence bundle against Derek, not just to remove him from the board, but to ensure his inability to practice business in this state again. The weight of the betrayal had vanished, replaced by the weight of the strategy. I slept soundly, something I hadn't done properly in years because I was no longer fighting shadows. I was moving facts. I sat at my mahogany desk, the wood scarred by countless hours of work. I picked up the leather-bound corporate charter, its pages yellowed with age, and felt a strange sense of ownership again. Not the ownership of wealth, but the ownership of consequence. They were so close to the finish line, they could taste the champagne. Derek had even started parking his new bright red Aston Martin in my reserved spot at the corporate headquarters, a petty, juvenile act of dominance. He truly believed I was blind, too tired to look out the window. But I saw. I saw everything. The date was set. 3 weeks from now, the annual shareholders' meeting. It was the only time all the moving parts, the legal entities, the external shareholders, the media, and the entire family, would be gathered in the same room. It was the stage I had built for 4 decades, and it would serve as the backdrop for the final necessary surgery. I picked up the secure phone and dialed Arthur. "Send me the final draft of the Texas filing, Arthur. I want it ready to be stamped by dawn. And tell Ms. Harding to ensure the press release is dated for 9 a.m. on the day of the meeting. We are no longer waiting for them to make their move. We are initiating ours." The silence returned, deep and absolute. I closed my eyes, picturing the moment Derek would see that blinding red Aston Martin being quietly towed out of the parking lot, just before he walked into the boardroom expecting to seize my chair, only to find the chair already filled by his replacement. They wanted a show. I was going to give them a performance worthy of the stage they had demanded. The silence returned, deep and absolute. I closed my eyes, picturing the moment Derek would see that blinding red Aston Martin being quietly towed out of the parking lot just before he walked into the boardroom expecting to seize my chair, only to find the chair already filled by his replacement. They wanted a show. I was going to give them a performance worthy of the stage they had demanded. They truly believed I was fading. That was the deepest cut, but also the sharpest tool in my arsenal. Sarah, my wife of 35 years, now treated me like a fragile antique waiting for the auctioneer's hammer. Her voice, once soft and inviting, had developed a patronizing lilt whenever she discussed my health, a completely fabricated heart condition I'd allowed my personal physician, Dr. Peterson, a man whose loyalty I secured 20 years ago with a silent investment in his clinic, to leak to her. They watched me slow down, watched the tremor in my hand, perfectly rehearsed, thanks to a few hours practicing with a weak dose of muscle relaxant, and saw not a husband or a father, but a dwindling bank account nearing zero. The arrogance was intoxicatingly predictable. Derek, our heir apparent, had already begun managing the company's capital like his personal piggy bank. He'd signed off on the lease of an entire floor in the Dallas high-rise for his futuristic tech incubator, a shell company whose primary function was, according to the transcripts Vanessa provided, funneling funds into his Panamanian holding trust. He didn't even bother to conceal the transactions well. Why would he? The old man was practically comatose. "He barely leaves the study, Marcus," Sarah had told her sister Brenda during a recorded conversation over lunch at the Four Seasons. "He just stares at the old photographs. He's already living in the past. We just have to wait for the paperwork to clear before we can finally liquidate that dreadful vineyard in Napa. I mean, who needs wine when you have champagne?" Dreadful vineyard. That vineyard was where I proposed to her in the summer of 1985, after closing the first major deal that launched Sterling Holdings. It wasn't about the wine. It was about the soil, the roots, the beginning of everything. She saw only the potential liquidation. Value. I sat in the secure room, the air conditioning humming low over the stack of folders that represented 4 decades of my life, meticulously dismantled by 2 people I had sworn to protect. Marcus Thorne, my lead counsel, a man whose reputation for being utterly merciless was only exceeded by his discretion, placed a final thin folder on the mahogany table. "This is the affidavit from Mr. Jenkins, sir. He confirms that Derek explicitly instructed him to inflate the maintenance costs on the Aspen property and divert the excess funds to Sarah's private account in Zurich. It's textbook embezzlement on both sides." Marcus didn't need to smile. His eyes held the cold, professional satisfaction of a predator who had found the perfect choke point. "And the total?" I asked, my voice level, not even a tremor, the real kind this time. Between Derek's shell corporations and Sarah's consulting fees from those shell companies, we are looking at roughly $18 million over the last 36 months. Enough for criminal charges, certainly, but more than enough to activate the morality clause we built into the trust structure just last week. I nodded slowly, my gaze fixed on the screen showing a live feed from my home study. Sarah was there, sitting at my desk, sipping tea, casually tearing up an old letter, a financial projection I had written on a napkin when the company was just a dream and a desperate prayer. She was erasing me, piece by quiet piece. "The clock is set, Marcus. 9 a.m. sharp on Monday. The board meeting is scheduled for 10 a.m. Everything is in motion, Robert. The irrevocable transfer of your controlling interest, shares to the newly established Sterling Philanthropic Foundation, becomes official the moment the clock strikes 9. The Foundation's charter explicitly excludes any directorship or benefit to individuals facing charges of corporate malfeasance. The system is watertight. The beauty of the plan lay in its silence. They expected a fight, a loud, messy courtroom drama where they could use my supposed fragility against me. They expected me to scream about the betrayal, but screaming gives them power. I chose surgical removal. For the past 6 months, while they were busy plotting my corporate demise, I had been busy redefining the very nature of my assets, The estate planning wasn't about who inherited the wealth. It was about ensuring the wealth continued to serve the purpose it was created for, a legacy of hard work, not reckless entitlement. Vanessa, my digital architect, leaned forward. "We have scheduled the release of the evidence packet, sir. It goes to the SEC, the company board, excluding the 2 members Derek bought off last quarter, and the Zurich authorities simultaneously at 9:05 a.m. They won't get 10 minutes to strategize." I finally allowed myself a small, grim exhale. The weight of the deception I had maintained, the feigned weakness, the forced smiles during dinner as Sarah discussed her next European jaunt, was heavy. But the weight of the coming justice was heavier and far more satisfying. The meeting was set for Monday. Derek thought he was walking in to sign the final papers transferring authority, cementing his reign. Sarah believed she was attending merely to celebrate their victory over the old tyrant. They didn't. Realized they were walking into a vacuum. They had underestimated the quiet man who built an empire from nothing. They mistook silence for weakness and patience for complacency. They had been so focused on counting the money in my coffin that they completely forgot I was still holding the shovel, and on Monday I would bury them in the consequences of their own avarice. The time for waiting was over. The time for reckoning was precisely 9 a.m. They believed the old man was slowing down. They thought the tremor in my hand when I signed the quarterly reports was a sign of frailty, not fury. Madison, my wife of 38 years, had started scheduling her spa treatments for the mornings I was meant to be reviewing the latest acquisition proposals, treating the company, the actual lifeblood of our existence, as an inconvenience that interrupted her leisure. Richard, our only son, was worse. He didn't even pretend to learn the industry. He simply waited for the monthly wire transfers, viewing my success not as a legacy to build upon, but as an endless ATM that had merely been too slow lately. The arrogance was breathtaking. It was the kind of spectacular entitlement that only decades of unearned comfort can breed. I overheard a conversation between Madison and her sister, Patricia, just last Tuesday. They thought I was asleep after lunch. Madison was detailing the interior renovations for the Charleston Beach House, I, property she had already mentally earmarked as hers. "It won't be long now," she chirped, a phrase that echoed the grim impatience of a vulture waiting for the lion to finish its meal. "He's tired, Patty. He looks grey. We just have to keep smiling and signing the invoices until the inevitable." They had forgotten that the man who built a logistics empire spanning 3 continents from a single leased warehouse in Dallas doesn't get tired. He gets strategic. That greyness they saw wasn't fatigue. It was the ashes of my former self, settling into a new foundation of calculated resolve. The initial shock of discovering their betrayal, the flagrant misuse of company funds, the secret meetings with rival firms, the sheer contempt in their private messages, had quickly solidified into cold, hard logic. I didn't cry or scream. I simply began to work. The investigation was handled with the same clinical precision I used when breaking into a new Asian market back in the late 80s. There was no emotion in it, only data. I called Stern, my corporate attorney, a man known for his discretion and his ability to make legal problems vanish, or in this case, appear precisely when needed. We initiated the audit of contempt. First came the digital cleanup. I installed remote monitoring software on every device connected to the house network, transforming our smart home system, the one Richard had insisted on installing, into my silent surveillance network. It was fascinating and nauseating to watch my life unfold in high definition from the sterile silence of my study. I watched Madison, not just spending the money, but laughing with her tennis coach, a man half her age, confirming the rumors I had previously dismissed as paranoid fantasy. I watched Richard attempting to forge my signature on documents related to the company's small endowment fund, clearly believing his old man was too blind to notice a few zeros misplaced. The financial forensic team, operating out of a secure office in Charlotte, worked non-stop for 3 months. They traced every penny. They didn't just find the transactions, they found the paper trail establishing intent. The shell companies Madison used to funnel decorating expenses into a private trust in the Cayman Islands were meticulously documented. The secret loans Richard took against corporate assets disguised as equipment. Leasing. We had the signed confirmations, including the explicit emails where he gloated about how easy it was to fool the old man's outdated systems. Every piece of evidence was triple authenticated, notarized, and sealed in separate legal packets. We weren't building a case for a family spat. We were building a case for criminal fraud and systematic asset stripping. This wasn't about divorce or cutting them out of a will. This was about justice defined by the harshest. Letter of the law. Stern and I met every Sunday afternoon, always at a remote, windowless office building downtown, far from the lavish Houston suburbs. He laid out the diagrams of my wealth like a general planning a military campaign. The goal was simple: complete and immediate sterilization of their access. Madison's name was quietly removed from all joint accounts. Her credit cards were flagged for immediate cancellation at the first legal filing, and the deed to the family home, the one she was already planning renovations for, was transferred into a holding trust accessible only by me, effective immediately upon the 9 a.m. meeting. The cruelty was not accidental. It was surgical. I could have simply disinherited them in my will, but that would have meant dying first, allowing them to enjoy the final years of my life while waiting for the payoff. I decided I preferred to watch them fall while I was very much alive, lucid, and signing the necessary documents. They needed to understand that the resources they had counted on were never truly theirs. They were merely granted, and what is granted can be swiftly revoked. Richard had just returned from a ski trip to Aspen, paid for entirely by a misappropriated corporate card. Madison was finalizing details for a gala charity event. Another opportunity to display the wealth she assumed was limitless. Their confidence was peaking. They were floating on an intoxicating cloud of greed and anticipation. They had no idea that their lavish lifestyle had become the evidence, and that every purchase, every trip, and every contemptuous email was now a nail in their own financial coffin. Last night I sat in my study, the leather chair cool beneath my fingers, the final stack of documents waiting. The air smelled faintly of old paper and new beginnings. I ran my hand over the signature line where I would, in a few hours, end the lives they knew. I felt a profound, desolate calm. 4 decades dedicated to building this name, this fortune, this legacy, only to have it treated as a disposable commodity by the very people I sought to protect. They mistook silence for weakness and patience for complacency. They had been so focused on counting the money in my coffin that they completely forgot I was still holding the shovel. And on Monday, I would bury them in the consequences of their own avarice. The time for waiting was over. The time for reckoning was precisely 9 a.m., and when they walked into my office, full of practiced smiles and false concern for my health, they would walk straight into the soundproof room where Stern and the sheriff's deputies were already waiting. They had been so focused on counting the money in my coffin that they completely forgot I was still holding the shovel. And on Monday, I would bury them in the consequences of their own avarice. The time for waiting was over. The time for reckoning was precisely 9 a.m., and when they walked into my office full of practiced smiles and false concern for my health, they would walk straight into the soundproof room where Stern and the sheriff's deputies were already waiting. The weekend was a strange, suspended reality. While I sat in my study in Charlotte, the heavy scent of old leather and polished mahogany surrounding me, they were finalizing their itineraries for the post-mortem spending spree. My son David called me Saturday morning, not to check on my blood pressure, but to casually mention the cost of the new yacht slip he was eyeing in Savannah. "Just thinking ahead, Dad," he'd chirped, his voice buzzing with thinly veiled impatience. "You know, for when the estate planning gets, finalized." He didn't even bother to lower his voice when he added, "The old man is barely lucid anyway, Mom says." I closed my eyes and listened. I didn't hang up. I just listened to the sound of my own blood, the same blood that ran through his veins, being poisoned by greed. This was the final layer of research I needed, the utter, unshakable certainty of their contempt. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively eroding the foundation I had spent 40 years constructing, brick by agonizing brick, since the summer of 1985 when I signed the lease on that first warehouse. That was the year I missed Elizabeth's third birthday because I was driving a forklift through the night. I missed David's graduation because I was closing the biggest deal of my life in Dallas. I sacrificed my time, my health, my youth, so they could inherit stability, not extravagance. And how did they repay that dedication? By treating my life's work like a lottery ticket they were impatient to scratch off. They had mistaken my silence for senescence. They had interpreted my controlled demeanor as weakness. It was the crucial error of the entitled. They believe intelligence is only demonstrated through noise and aggressive posturing. They never noticed the cameras I had installed during the security upgrade 6 months ago, not just in the corporate offices, but subtly placed within the mansion's ventilation system. The feeds were routed through an encrypted server in Switzerland that only Stern and I had access to. It was agonizing to watch. I watched their meetings with predatory lawyers held late at night in my own library, using my scotch and my leather chairs. I saw Elizabeth, my wife of 35 years, hand over corporate documents she had no right to possess, discussing how to legally sideline my voting shares based on manufactured claims of mental instability. I saw David forge my signature on 3 different loan guarantees, believing the company's internal auditing was too slow or too incompetent to catch the subtle pressure difference of a pen held by a desperate hand versus a steady, practiced one. Stern, my lawyer and the only truly loyal man left in my immediate orbit, called it a masterpiece of self-destruction. We didn't need to fight them, we just needed to document them fighting me. For 3 months we compiled the evidence. The forensic accounting proving David's embezzlement through shell companies. Cousin Greg's landscaping business turned out to be quite lucrative for a front. The video and audio recordings confirming Elizabeth's conspiracy to commit corporate fraud and her active role in fabricating medical records. The signed affidavits from the 3 people she had paid to testify to my supposed erratic behavior. The most painful document wasn't the footage of their betrayal. It was the revised, finalized last will and testament, drafted and notarized 2 weeks ago. It was clinical, devoid of emotion, and irreversible. Every trust fund, every share, every piece of real estate acquired during our marriage, except for the small remote cabin in Montana, was strategically allocated, not to them, but to a newly established philanthropic foundation dedicated to the memory of my first partner, who died building this firm with me before the glamour and the greed took over. The foundation's board? Stern, and 2 of my oldest, most principled competitors. Zero access, zero control for my family. Sunday night, I sat alone, reviewing the files one last time. I felt no rage, just a chilling, definitive closure. The old man wasn't just lucid, he was meticulously prepared. The legal framework we had built was a fortress. The divorce papers for Elizabeth included a comprehensive financial declaration that would leave her only with the assets acquired before 1990, effectively stripping her of every cent earned from the company's real growth. The criminal referrals for David and Elizabeth were already lodged with the district attorney, contingent on the Monday morning execution of the corporate restructuring. I went to bed at 10, sleeping soundly for the first time in months. The nightmare wasn't the betrayal itself. The nightmare was the uncertainty of how to respond. Now there was no uncertainty. There was only the schedule. The alarm went off at 6 a.m. Monday. I dressed in my best charcoal suit, the one I usually reserved for major board meetings. I clipped my tie and looked in the mirror. My face was lined, my hair white, but my eyes were sharp and clear. They looked like the eyes of a man who had finally finished a colossal task. By 8:45 a.m., Stern was in the office, his briefcase bulging with the documents that represented a lifetime of legal strategy. The soundproof room, the boardroom ironically, had been prepared. The deputy sheriff and his colleague, discreetly positioned in the adjoining private conference room, were instructed to remain unseen unless required to enforce the immediate restraining orders. At 8:58 a.m., I heard the familiar, irritatingly cheerful clatter of David and Elizabeth arriving together. They were laughing about something trivial, probably planning a renovation for the wing of the house they thought they would soon inherit. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it just as they approached. Their smiles, wide and rehearsed, froze the moment they saw the steel in my gaze. They didn't see a sick, fading man. They saw the founder, they saw the judge. "Good morning," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Please, come in. We have a lot of paperwork to get through this morning. Stern is waiting." They walked past me into the room, their initial confusion quickly turning to alarm as they saw the pile of manila folders labeled "Final." They realized too late that this was not a discussion about my health. This was the reading of the sentence, and the door to the soundproof room clicked shut behind them. The reckoning had begun. "You look tired, Father," Mark said, trying to inject a false note of filial concern into his voice. He leaned against the table, assuming a casual posture that screamed impatience. "Can we speed this up? I have a 2 o'clock meeting with the board regarding the new Denver acquisition." I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch until the air in the soundproof room grew heavy, almost viscous. Mark fidgeted, finally shifting his weight, the confidence draining from him like bath water. They never learned. They mistook my measured pace for senility, my deep-seated pain for weakness. Eleanor, seated directly opposite me, was already scanning the room, calculating how much this room and the adjacent wing of the corporate office were worth. She wore the look of a beneficiary waiting for the doctor to pronounce the time of death so she could cash the life insurance. "The Denver acquisition, Mark," I finally replied, my voice a low rumble that always commanded attention, even if they had forgotten how to listen. "An ambitious project. Pity you won't be needing that 2 o'clock meeting." Mark scoffed, a small dismissive sound. "What do you mean, Father? I'm running operations now, pending your—" He stopped himself just short of saying, "inevitable departure." Stern, my counsel, a man whose reputation was built on burying evidence and unearthing truths, adjusted his tie. He was enjoying this immensely, the perfect audience for my final performance. He knew every excruciating detail of the past 6 months, details Eleanor and the children were about to learn. They saw me as a relic, a stubborn man clinging to the empire I built with my bare hands since the summer of 1985. They saw the thinning white hair and the slow walk, and assumed the mind underneath was equally faded. They believed they were smarter, faster, and more modern. They couldn't fathom that while they were busy spending, I was busy watching. The betrayal, the single blinding moment that shattered the illusion of family, began subtly. A discrepancy in the quarterly financial reports, a figure too neat to be true. A younger me would have called the CFO and demanded an explanation. The older me, the man who dedicated 4 decades to this organization, missing birthdays and anniversaries to secure futures they simply took for granted, called someone else entirely. I didn't hire a detective, Eleanor. Detectives follow people. I hired a specialized corporate intelligence firm, the kind that dismantles hostile takeovers. Their mandate was simple: treat my family as a competing entity attempting to steal my primary assets. The surveillance was surgical. It wasn't about catching Eleanor with another man, though that detail was certainly a bonus in the divorce proceedings. It was about the finances, the paper trail, the contemptuous greed. They installed listening devices in the Aspen vacation home, just as I suspected. They wanted to know when I was leaving for the hospital next, but what they captured was far more damning. They captured Mark, complaining to Sarah about the old man's outdated philosophies and how they just needed to wait him out. They had already mentally liquidated the company, earmarking my holdings for luxury yachts and private jets. The manila folders stacked before them were not simply documents, they were the complete forensic analysis of their lives. Folder 1. The Cayman Shell Corporation, detailing the millions Eleanor siphoned off through fake consulting contracts over the last 5 years. Folder 2. The Las Vegas Marker, which meticulously tracked Mark's 7-figure gambling debts, disguised as corporate R&D expenditures to defraud shareholders. Folder 3. Operation Philanthropy, showing how Sarah's supposed charity for underprivileged youth was merely a tax-deductible funnel into her boyfriend's bankrupt Silicon Valley venture. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply collected evidence. While Mark was assuring me over Thanksgiving dinner that he was holding down the fort, I was meeting with the district attorney about the tax fraud implications. While Eleanor was shopping for new drapes for the penthouse in Miami, I was executing the final corporate restructuring, the poison pill. "The board meeting in Denver is irrelevant, Mark," I said, picking up the first folder. My hands were steady. "Because you were removed as chief operating officer 2 weeks ago, effective immediately." Mark's face went white, the arrogance instantly evaporating, replaced by raw shock. He looked at Eleanor, who was finally realizing the gravity of the scene. "That's impossible," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. "I would have been notified. The legal team—" "Our legal team," I corrected gently. "Stern's team. They handled it. Silently. I dedicated the last 6 months of my life to building a fortress around the only thing that mattered to me now, the integrity of what I built. They thought I was dying. In truth, I was simply retreating, building the perfect trap. The company, the colossal entity they viewed as their inheritance, was no longer mine to give. It was placed into an irrevocable trust, designed to self-sustain, managed by an independent board of trustees, with strict clauses preventing anyone convicted of corporate malfeasance from ever holding a share or position. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking slightly. "You see, I may be old, but I am not stupid. You waited for me to die. I decided to live. And I decided very carefully who would pay the price for that misunderstanding." I pushed the stack of papers labeled divorce decree and restitution order across the table towards Eleanor. It was a single clean sweep of my hand. The quiet click of Stern's pen as he prepared to speak was the sound of the guillotine falling. They looked at the documents, finally seeing the full scope of my preparation, the sheer ruthless totality of their downfall. The reckoning had begun, and they were trapped inside the silence I had engineered for them. Eleanor didn't scream. That would have been too honest, too vulnerable. Instead, she laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that scratched the silence in Stern's office. She looked up from the documents, her eyes narrowed to 2 slivers of sapphire ice, the kind of look she usually reserved for a server who brought the wrong vintage. "Arthur, darling," she purred, leaning back in the leather chair I had paid for, "is this some kind of pathetic joke? You really think a few notarized threats will scare me? We've been married for 38 years. I know how your mind works. This dramatic display. It's just you trying to regain control because you're bored of the golf course." She picked up the restitution order, glancing at the 7-figure sum demanded, and tossed the document back onto the mahogany table. My son Jason, sitting beside her, didn't bother to look at the papers at all. His focus was entirely on his phone, scrolling through some stock ticker, or perhaps planning his next irresponsible purchase. That was the essence of the betrayal, wasn't it? The casual, total subestimation. They believed my entire existence was wrapped up in providing the scaffolding for their luxurious lives, and that when the time came, I would be too sentimental, too tired, or too afraid of scandal to truly sever the tie. They mistook my methodical silence for senility. They confused my deliberate patience with weakness. "Read page 12, Eleanor," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the acid churning in my stomach. Stern, bless his precision, adjusted his glasses, ready to follow the script we had rehearsed meticulously over the last 6 months. Jason finally lowered his phone, annoyance flickering across his face. "Dad, seriously. Look, you need to stop listening to Stern. He's just billing you for this drama. We can talk about the pre-nuptial adjustments at home, but trying to freeze Mom's accounts? That's absurd. Everything is intertwined. You know the foundation funds are legally protected." He spoke the word legally with the confidence of someone who had never actually read a legal document written in anything other than summary form. "The foundation," I murmured, leaning forward just enough to capture their attention, "was established in the summer of 1985, Jason. The summer I worked 90-hour weeks sleeping on a cot in that miserable office park outside Hartford, just so I could afford the down payment on the house your mother insisted on in Greenwich. It wasn't built on protected funds, it was built on my sweat, my credit, and my belief in a future you two systematically tried to liquidate. I had not raised my voice. The volume was low, intimate, and infinitely colder than any shout could be. The investigation started not with suspicion, but with a nagging feeling, a financial irregularity that the CFO tried to smooth over last year. It was a misplaced decimal point in a wire transfer to a subsidiary in the Caymans. Most men would have let it go, but I had built the entire infrastructure of Allied Tech on precision. I started pulling the thread quietly, without mentioning it to Eleanor or Jason. The true work began 6 months ago when I brought Stern in, not as a divorce attorney but as a specialist in forensic corporate architecture. We didn't hire the flashy PIs who chase sports cars. We hired the quiet network analysts, the ones who know how to map a digital footprint from New York to Miami without ever pinging a public tower. While Eleanor was hosting her endless charity galas, the ones she claimed were for underprivileged children, but were mostly thinly veiled networking opportunities for her lover, Douglas, my team was mapping every single financial transaction. They discovered the shell corporations Jason had set up in Delaware, ostensibly for future investments, but which were, in reality, conduits to siphon money. From the foundation and bankroll his disastrous cryptocurrency ventures. We tracked the hotel bookings, not just for the affair, but for the meetings Eleanor held with external counsel, discussing how quickly they could liquidate my holdings if I were to become incapacitated. I watched them living their second lives on the monitoring system I had discreetly installed. A small investment in high-definition security feeds, masked as smart home upgrades, that Eleanor had demanded. I saw the way she looked at Douglas, the way Jason barely concealed his impatience for me to step down. I saw it all, month after month, while I dined alone in the vast, echoing dining room of the home I no longer recognized. I didn't confront them. Confrontation is messy, emotional, and leaves room for negotiation and lies. I needed certainty. I needed an iron grip that could not be shaken by pleas or tears. Stern had spent 4 months weaving a legal net so fine, so precise, that when the papers were served, they would find every escape route had been sealed off. We didn't just freeze accounts, we identified the ownership structure of every asset they had acquired using stolen funds, preparing the legal precedent for unjust enrichment and fraudulent conveyance. You see, Jason, I continued, gesturing toward the thick binder Stern had placed on the table, you were right about one thing. Everything is intertwined, but you misunderstood who holds the loom. I tapped the first page of the accompanying binder. The headline read, Emergency Injunction and Cease and Desist Order, Pending Securities Fraud Investigation. Those foundation funds you mentioned, protected by law, they are now protected by the federal authorities because I didn't just file for divorce. I provided the SEC and the FBI with comprehensive proof of the money laundering operations you ran through Allied Tech subsidiaries to cover your mother's exorbitant lifestyle and your bad debts. That wire transfer from the Caymans, it wasn't a mistake. It was the key to the vault. The color drained instantly from Eleanor's face. The laughter was gone, replaced by a deep, terrifying paralysis. Jason finally stopped looking at his phone. He looked at me, not with annoyance, but with genuine, cold terror. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had forgotten that the man who built an empire from nothing also knows exactly how to tear it down, and he always keeps the blueprint safe. So, Eleanor, I finished, allowing a quiet moment of satisfaction to settle on the wreckage of her composure, this isn't a threat. This is the official notice that as of exactly 9 a.m. this morning, you and Jason are no longer employees, board members, or beneficiaries of anything associated with my name. Every asset you acquired using company funds is now subject to seizure and restitution. You will sign the divorce decree, waive any claim to spousal support, and in return, the FBI will consider reducing the charges against Jason from felony fraud to something less permanent. You may retain whatever you can carry out of the house by tomorrow afternoon. Good luck finding Douglas. He was served his own restraining order 20 minutes ago. Eleanor's face, usually set in that familiar entitled mask of aloof patience, the look she wore waiting for her. Inheritance crumbled. The shock wasn't just the news, it was the realization that the man she had called a husband for 32 years, the man she routinely dismissed as a sentimental relic, had been preparing this moment with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of a judge. She finally found her voice, a harsh, dry whisper that lacked any of its usual theatrical bite. "You think this is over, Robert? You think you can just erase me after everything I gave you?" I leaned back against the mahogany desk, the polished wood cool against the back of my hand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence in that vast library in Phoenix, usually filled with the sound of her demanding staff or talking to her lover on the hidden phone line, amplified every word I spoke. "You gave me nothing, Eleanor, that wasn't already mine to build," I corrected her, my tone flat. "You mistook comfort for contribution. You mistook access to my resources for ownership. That was your fundamental, fatal miscalculation. You thought because I was silent, I was blind. You thought because I still occasionally brought you flowers, I was stupid." That was the deepest cut of all, the sheer, arrogant underestimation. For years, as my hair turned silver and the weight of running Ascendant Group pressed down on my shoulders, they had begun to treat me like a minor inconvenience, a sentimental fixture they were waiting to turn off. Jason, our son, had started raiding the company accounts not just because he was greedy, but because he genuinely believed I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care enough to act. He thought I was too tired, too soft, too focused on the past to protect the future. The truth was, the investigation began the summer I first caught the scent of dishonesty, not the smell of cheap perfume or infidelity, but the distinct metallic tang of corporate theft. It was a subtle discrepancy in the quarterly audit for our New York holding company, masked by a sophisticated shell game Jason believed was impenetrable. I didn't confront him. I didn't yell at Eleanor. I didn't hire a flashy private eye who might sell the story to a tabloid. Instead, I retreated into the world I knew best, infrastructure and security. I called James Roth, my lawyer for nearly 4 decades, a man who knows the law like a priest knows scripture. I didn't tell him the whole story at first, only that I needed a complete legal separation of my personal assets from the company structure, and I needed it done in a way that left no digital or paper trail leading back to Eleanor or Jason. Then came the surveillance. They expected cameras on the perimeter of the estate. They expected security guards at the gate, but they never expected the custom-built proprietary systems I installed. Microphones embedded in the HVAC vents, tiny pinhole lenses behind the gold leaf, framing of the family portraits, and keylogging software installed remotely on all their personal devices. Every text, every hushed phone call, every panicked meeting between Eleanor, Jason, and the hapless Douglas was recorded, time-stamped, and catalogued. My life became a cold, meticulous exercise in evidence gathering. Every night, after pretending to read the news, I would go down to my soundproof study, the room they never entered because they found my work boring, and sift through the digital debris of their betrayal. I watched Eleanor whispering sweet nothings to Douglas while simultaneously instructing Jason on how to pressure me into an early retirement. I saw the spreadsheets detailing the millions siphoned off for luxury apartments and useless ventures. It wasn't rage that fueled me. It was a profound, aching disappointment. I had sacrificed my youth, my health, and countless weekends to build a legacy, not a piggy bank for spoiled children and a faithless wife. The cost wasn't just financial. I felt the steel-cold certainty of absolute solitude settling over me. Yet that solitude granted me clarity. "You speak of what you gave me," I continued, watching the flicker of panic in her eyes. "Let's talk about what I gave you. I gave you trust, Eleanor. You spent it like loose change." She tried a desperate maneuver, her face hardening into indignation. "You manipulated us. You spied on your own family. That's not legal." "On the contrary," I replied, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. Every piece of evidence gathered was done so legally, either on property I solely owned and controlled, or by recording conversations to which I was a party, or which pertained directly to the fraud being committed against my corporation. James made sure of that. We didn't cut corners. We built an airtight fortress of evidence. The most painful part of the preparation was Jason. While Eleanor's actions were purely selfish, Jason's fraud threatened the stability of Ascendant Group. I had to choose between protecting my son from prison and protecting the thousands of employees who depended on the company. The choice, for the sake of the legacy, was easy, though agonizing. That's why the FBI involvement was leveraged. It was the only way to ensure he wouldn't destroy the company from the inside after I was gone. The documents you received detailing your financial forfeiture are merely the beginning, Eleanor, I told her, finally pushing away from the desk. This was the moment I had anticipated for months, the true execution of the plan. She only saw the divorce. She hadn't looked at the corporate restructuring. You still believe you have the power to disrupt the company, don't you? You and Jason assumed that because I held 90% of the voting shares, the moment I filed for divorce, you could tie Ascendant up in probate hell for years, forcing me to negotiate a larger settlement just to maintain operational fluidity. Her eyes widened slightly, confirming her strategy. That was the endgame they had planned: financial extortion using corporate gridlock. That plan, like all your others, was based on an outdated assessment of my capabilities, I said softly. While you were meeting with Douglas at that overpriced condo in Miami, I executed the final phase of the corporate restructuring. Yesterday, the Ascendant Group Board of Directors, loyal men and women who you and Jason routinely insulted, unanimously approved the complete transfer of my remaining voting shares into a blind trust. The silence that followed this declaration was absolute. This trust is managed by 3 independent trustees, none of whom have any personal relationship with me or my family. The terms are simple. The trust is irrevocable, impenetrable by any divorce proceeding or probate court, and the sole beneficiary is the Ascendant Group Foundation, ensuring the company's stability and its future charity commitments. The terms explicitly prevent Jason, you, or Douglas from ever holding a seat on the board or drawing a salary from any affiliated entity. I watched the color drain from her face. She wasn't just losing the money, she was losing the war, and the battlefield she thought she controlled had evaporated beneath her feet. You have until tomorrow afternoon to leave the house. The locks will be changed precisely at 4 p.m. Do not contact me again, Eleanor. Your debt is paid, not to me, but to the company you tried to dismantle. Now you will face the consequences of thinking I was just a sentimental old fool. You have until tomorrow afternoon to leave the house. The locks will be changed precisely at 4 p.m. Do not contact me again, Eleanor. Your debt is paid, not to me, but to the company you tried to dismantle. Now you will face the consequences of thinking I was just a sentimental old fool. Her eyes, usually cold and assessing, were finally wide with a terror I recognized, the terror of a predator who finds itself suddenly caught in a trap it ignored. She tried to pivot, her voice sharp and brittle. This is ridiculous, Arthur. I'll call David Jenkins. You can't legally do this to me. This entire farce is based on some fabricated clause you dug up from 1985. We built this life together. I leaned back in the polished mahogany chair, the scent of old leather and settled justice filling the air of the downtown Boston office. My attorney, Kenneth, impassive as a marble statue, slid a second document across the table. The Jenkins firm is already aware, Eleanor. Mr. Jenkins, a man for whom I have great respect, has advised his entire practice to abstain from this matter, given the severity of the fiduciary breaches outlined in the exhibit before you. And regarding 1985, I paused, letting the weight of 4 decades settle between us. That clause, which you dismissed as obsolete boilerplate, is precisely why the Arthur Sterling Foundation for Corporate Integrity, which owns 98% of the holding corporation that holds the deeds to all assets you currently enjoy, is entirely untouchable. I didn't just draft those documents back when you were choosing wallpaper. I drafted them with the precise foresight that eventually someone, whether a competitor or an ingrate, would try to take what wasn't theirs. She scoffed, a strangled sound that was meant to be defiant. Ingrate? You think I'm an ingrate because I dared to have a life while you were buried in spreadsheets in Chicago? You should be grateful I stayed this long, waiting for you to slow down, waiting for the natural conclusion of your Your empire. That was the deepest cut, the core of the rot, the arrogance of their patience. They weren't just waiting for the assets. They were waiting for me to die, assuming the inheritance was guaranteed, assuming the old man was too tired, too blind, or too devoted to notice the vultures circling the nest. They never realized that building an empire teaches you paranoia as a fundamental necessity. You learn to listen to the sounds that aren't being made, and you learn to always check the locks. The investigation had started subtly, a year. How? It wasn't the stray email or the receipt for a weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard that triggered me. It was the change in her behavior regarding the company's internal reporting. Suddenly, Eleanor, who couldn't care less about quarterly earnings, was asking pointed questions about the offshore holding structures I had established back when the U.S. tax code was less forgiving. That's when I called the specialized firm in Miami, not a divorce detective, but a corporate espionage unit. I told them, I need a forensic deep dive into every communication channel she uses, every financial interaction with anyone named Marcus, and every shell company created in the last 2 years that uses the word Aegis or Phoenix. The results were chillingly precise. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a planned surgical extraction. Eleanor and Marcus, her personal trainer, 30 years her junior, were attempting to leverage the very structures I created to protect the business during hostile takeovers. They were treating my life's work as severance pay, planning to liquidate the family trust the moment the medical examiner signed my death certificate. They were so convinced of my sentimental weakness that they grew sloppy. They used company servers for detailed planning sessions. They laughed about my antiquated security protocols in encrypted chats, protocols that my team was watching in real time from a secure server farm in North Carolina. For 6 months I lived a double life. By day I was the tired CEO, spending weekends golfing and pretending not to notice the cold shoulder at dinner in our Greenwich estate. By night I was Arthur Sterling, the founder, working with Kenneth and a team of white-collar crime specialists to systematically untangle every thread they had pulled. We didn't just file for divorce, we filed a corporate injunction. We moved every liquid asset, every property deed, every intellectual property holding into the foundation. They didn't lose the marriage, they lost their status as beneficiaries, and more importantly, they incurred massive personal liability for breach of fiduciary duty to the holding company. While Eleanor was busy buying a new convertible for Marcus, believing my health was failing and the end was near, Kenneth was ensuring that the legal language would strip her of everything, including her voting rights on the residential properties. She didn't own the mansion. The foundation leased it to us. Now the lease was terminated. The only thing you built, Eleanor, I stated, my voice low and steady, was a fantasy based on entitlement. I built the empire. And the empire, sadly, is now classifying you as an unwarranted liability. Marcus, by the way, received his notification an hour ago. He has until 6 p.m. to vacate his apartment in Manhattan, the one you purchased for him. Since he used stolen corporate funds for the down payment, the property is now subject to immediate forfeiture. He also breached a non-disclosure agreement he signed unknowingly when you hired him for personal consulting services last year. He won't be speaking to the press. I watched her face crumble. The realization of the scope of the operation, the silence, the planning, the absolute ruthlessness, finally hit her. It wasn't the spectacle she expected. It was an execution by spreadsheet. She stood up abruptly, knocking the chair back, her manicured hands trembling. You hate me this much? Hate requires investment, Eleanor. I haven't invested in you for a long time, I corrected, closing my folder. This isn't personal hatred. This is a clean-up operation, and tomorrow at 4 p.m. I will finally be able to breathe the clear air of a structure that is entirely free of contamination. I rose, giving her one last glance. She stood there, frozen, realizing the depth of the ocean she had tried to cross without a boat, having mistaken my kindness for weakness, my patience for incompetence. She finally understood that the man she thought was a fool was merely a patient observer, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy the traps he had set 4 decades ago, and now the clock was ticking down to 0. The clock didn't tick down to zero for her. It ticked down for the life she thought she owned. For me, the countdown ended the moment the lawyer, Mr. Stern, placed the final notarized signature on the revised trust documents. That silence, 2 weeks after our last conversation, was deafening. It was the silence before the detonation. I chose the venue carefully, the third-floor conference room at the Sterling Tower in Chicago, where I had signed the initial incorporation papers back in the summer of 1985. Glass walls, a mahogany table built for 12, and the oppressive weight of 4. Decades of my sweat concentrated in that space. This was not merely an office, it was the altar where I had sacrificed my youth and the arena where the final reckoning would occur. They arrived precisely on time, dressed in the expensive armor that my labor had purchased. Eleanor, my wife, maintained a practiced veneer of icy superiority, the look of a woman who had endured a temporary marital dispute but knew her financial security was sacrosanct. James, my son, sauntered in, late, adjusting the cufflink I'd bought him last Christmas, a trinket I now deeply regretted. He winked at Eleanor. The unspoken conspiracy between them was visible to me, the patient watcher. Sarah, always the most calculated, was already sitting, pen poised over a notepad, mentally calculating the quarterly dividends she expected. They were also confidently, catastrophically wrong. I didn't offer pleasantries. My composure was absolute, honed over weeks of sleepless calculation. The pain of the betrayal had curdled into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. I nodded at Stern, who sat opposite me, his face a perfect mask of professional neutrality. He was a man who had seen too much human avarice to be shocked, but even he gripped the bound document a little tighter than usual. "Please, Mr. Stern, let's proceed." Stern cleared his throat, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet room. He began reading the standard formalities of the Sterling family trust, listing the initial beneficiaries, them. They listened with bored impatience, waiting for the figures. Then Stern paused, adjusting his reading glasses, and moved to the amendment, dated 3 days prior. The atmosphere in the room solidified, transitioning instantly from a routine meeting to a death sentence. Due to demonstrable and chronic breaches of fiduciary duty, as well as calculated attempts at asset manipulation against the sole founder and grantor, Stern's voice was dry, mercilessly precise. The principal beneficiary designation for Eleanor Sterling, James Sterling Jr., and Sarah Sterling is hereby revoked, effective immediately. For a moment, they simply blinked. The human mind refuses to accept sudden total annihilation. Eleanor smiled, a strange, brittle gesture, as if waiting for the punchline. What is this, Dad?" James stammered, the color draining from his face, leaving his skin sickly pale beneath the expensive tan. "A legal joke?" I finally spoke, my voice low, perfectly controlled, cutting through the rising tide of their panic. "It's not a joke, James. It's the consequence of believing that the man who built the castle was too old, too blind, or too sentimental to defend it." Eleanor slammed her hand on the mahogany table, shattering her composure entirely. "You can't do this, Richard. We built this together, 40 years. "You built nothing, Eleanor," I corrected, my gaze steady. "You decorated. I built the structure, the foundation, the steel beams, the systems. You were a guest in the house, and guests, when they attempt to burn the furniture and steal the blueprints, lose their invitation, permanently." Stern intervened, flipping to the evidentiary section of the trust update. He presented the proof with cold, efficient clarity. The surveillance footage of Eleanor meeting with the rival asset manager to offload company shares before my expected retirement, their euphemism for my death. The wire transfers James authorized without my knowledge to bail out his failed ventures. The documents Sarah signed to leverage company property for her useless boutique. My investigation hadn't just proven emotional betrayal, it proved criminal financial intent. The execution was brutal and thorough. They were not merely removed from the trust. The company's internal auditors, already positioned, were simultaneously seizing all company-issued assets attached to their names, corporate phones, keycards, leased vehicles, and most satisfyingly, The credit lines. The 3 properties you currently occupy in Miami, Napa Valley, and Greenwich are company assets leased back to the trust, I continued, leaning back, watching the light die in their eyes as comprehension dawned. The leases expire at midnight tonight. The security detail has been instructed to assist you in retrieving your immediate personal belongings, clothes, toiletries, family photographs, nothing else. As for the accounts you believed were secured offshore, they were shell corporations, owned by Sterling, not by you. The money returns to the foundation. They were left with the clothes on their backs and the realization that their entire safety net, their sense of entitlement, had been an illusion woven by the man they intended to betray. Sarah dissolved into muffled, choked sobs. James began to threaten litigation, but the look Stern gave him, a look that promised years of devastating, unwinnable legal battles, silenced him quickly. Eleanor merely stared, her face contorted by a mixture of shock and the sudden, visceral panic of a woman stripped of her status. She was looking at me, her husband of 40 years, as if I were a stranger, a monster. She failed to realize the monster she saw was merely the reflection of her own greed. I stood, gathering my coat. The business was concluded. I had restored order, balance, and justice to the world I had built. Mr. Stern will handle the formalities, I said, addressing the stunned, silent room. I have a plane to catch. I walked out of that conference room and into the waiting elevator, not looking back as the sounds of police intervention began faintly in the distance. The pain was still there, a raw scar of decades lost, but the poison that had festered within my family was finally purged. The air I breathed for the first time in memory was clean. The next morning I stood on the small, unassuming roof terrace of a condo in downtown Austin, Texas, a place I had quietly purchased under a corporate alias years ago, just in case the worst happened. The air was warm, smelling of cedar and possibility. The great empire, now restructured and sealed off from the rot, was managed by an impartial board of professionals. I had shed the weight of ownership and the burden of betrayal. I poured a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise, not over the imposing gray steel of Chicago, but over the rolling hills of Texas. I was an old man, certainly, but I felt lighter, freer than I had in 20 years. My phone chimed softly. It was Amelia, the foundation director I had met months prior while setting up the contingency plan. She was smart, dedicated, and knew me only as Richard, a dedicated philanthropist ready to start a new, focused chapter. She knew nothing about the massacre I had just orchestrated. I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile for the first time in a lifetime. "Good morning, Amelia," I said, looking out at the vast, unblemished horizon. "I'm ready to start today. Tell me about the first project."